Boker Tov. Today's stuff is Lamed Vo 36. And we pick up at the very top of Lamed Vo Lamed Aleph. And we're dealing with the issue that when a widow comes to collect from the estate, instead of having to make a shavua because of the heavy consequences of a sheker, even an unintentional one, they switch to having to make a neder, a vow. And now the Gemara, and we actually saw an interesting issue where it's according to some Amoraim, they were afraid that they couldn't trust that, and then they would let her even make a vow, and then she couldn't collect, and it showed a little undermining of the whole purpose of the tikkun olam, and of the understanding that there's a necessity to fix the situation, and then there was sort of like a reverse. Then there was a pushback on that to get back to the original state. But I mentioned that because we're going to be seeing some more of that coming up as well, about how some of these institutions of Tikkun Olam might have experienced some pushback at a later stage. Anyway, now we're dealing with the issue that she makes a neder, and the Gemara's question is, well, why will that neder suffice? First of all, can she make it once she's already married? Then her husband can annul it. Can she make it in general, and then a chacham, she can go to a sage and have it and have it voided? So the Gemara actually said when she's already married, according to one opinion, she could not make it because then her husband will just annul it and it won't prove anything. According to another opinion, it would be possible to make it, but if she made it birabin, if she made it in public, and maybe that would exclude it from being voided. Now, one thing I should say about that, because we're about to get to the difference to birabim and aldas rabim, is that birabim means in public, right? And whatever the definition of public, Rashi says 10, and aldas rabim means it's sort of like, it's not just based on what I have in mind, but somehow it would be based on what the tzibur would have in mind, at least theoretically. So we'll see in a minute about what that means. But here Tosfos points out that when it comes to the issue of the husband being able to void it, aldas rabim would not help, even though aldas rabim in other situations might prevent any vow from being voided. That's when, because the nature of the process of me going to a sage to annul the vow, to void the vow, is that I say, well, under these circumstances, I wouldn't have made it. It wasn't really my intent. It wasn't really my das. Had I made it in error, I made it without due consideration, and so on. So if it's not about my das, if it's somehow it's dependent on everybody else's das, so that closes off the possibility of going to the sage. That's the idea of al das rabin. But it's somewhat of the opposite, or it could be the opposite, when it comes to the husband. When the husband voids his wife's vows, does a hafara of his wife's vow, it doesn't matter what she was thinking. Right. She could have been 100% committed to it, no toes at all. He just has the power to void it. So doing aldas rabin doesn't help. So what? You didn't have a toes. My wife, as my wife, you didn't have a toes. I don't care that the rabin didn't have a toes. I have the power to void it. Who cares what das is involved? Okay, but birabim might work because birabim means it's no longer a private affair between the two of us. If it's a private affair between me and my wife, I can void her vow. Once it's done in public and it's a matter of like public record, then it takes it out of that like private realm, and I can't void it. Okay, so what's the issue about how does the neder work if she's married? According to one opinion, no. According to another opinion, yes. If she makes it not aldas rabin, that wouldn't help. But birabim, according to this opinion, if a wife makes a vow in public, okay, then that might exclude the husband's ability to void it, and then that would be a solution in this case. 1 minute. That's the case about if she's married. In a normal case, well, how do we close off the possibility that she might go to a sage and get it permitted, and then the neder won't be able to be effective and based into let or collect? So here we have 2 or 3 answers. Number one is maybe when you go to a sage, you are tzarich lefaret et haneder. You have to give the circumstances under which it's made, and therefore specifically for reasons such as this. So the sage will know that I can't allow this vow. This vow allowed you to collect, right? It's not something that I could allow. Okay, so that's one opinion. Another opinion says no. Normally you don't have to be mefared neder. There's a phrase that once you start giving information, it won't be complete information. And according to the other opinion, that you are not mefared et haneder, or you don't have to. So we're afraid that it will be. So how you stop going to the sage? So according to this opinion, it would only be, for example, if the only way we would allow this to work is a vow the vow would have to be made either again birabin in public or aldas rabin, and that's what we're about to explore now. This issue of a vow made in public or a vow made on the das of the public, on the intent, on the will of the masses, and that may be the only case in which this vow is that this woman makes, even an unmarried woman, or a widowed woman, makes if in order to allow her to collect from her dead husband's estate. Michael, you had a question?
Yeah, I would have thought is that it would have been sort of Das Rabin would have trumped it. I would have thought the Rabin just would have been right there. The 10 people there, how many people are there? They're sort of listening. They're witnesses. Or Das Rabin is like, not only are we witnesses, but like we're like really paying attention. You know what I mean? Like it's with our knowledge and like awareness and cognizance and support.
Right. Well, that is the difference. But Das Rabin doesn't need anybody to be present. It's just no. Well, you could always combine two, but they are two different concepts. So let's take a look at the Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara says, so I understand. Okay, so let's take 3 lines on the bottom, Lamed Hamid Bet. So let's repeat that. Via Marta, it's Ein Otarch Lefarid Taned there. But if you don't normally have to detail the conditions of how the vow is made, let's be afraid that somebody will go to a sage and the sage will permit it. Okay, so how how will this work? That a woman can make actually this is the case of him. What's the case here? Oh, Kohen, thank you. Right. So the case we had just dealt with was a Kohen who makes a vow to not get benefit from his wife that he's not allowed to be married to. Let's say a case of a Grusha. How do we let that vow work and let him do the avoda? Maybe he'll just go and release himself from the vow. So a similar case to our case of the Amana. So the Gemara says, top of Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, to Madirin le birabin. So we make him take the vow in public, and that will close off the ability of doing a hatara of going to a chacham. So it says 1 minute. That's good according to the opinion that if it's in public, you cannot be annulled by the husband, and therefore presumably cannot be voided by the chacham either. But according to the idea that it can be annulled by the husband, and similarly, we're assuming by the sage. So Michael Ameimar. So what solution do you have? So the Gemara says, al das Rabin. So not that it's in public, but it's on the das of the public.
It's a reflection of public opinion.
Something that's a way of saying it, like how the public would, what we presume the public would intend for such a it's for such a case.
It's a very interesting category.
Well, it takes it out of my subjective das.
Right.
Okay, but it doesn't mean
your subjective as to what they're thinking.
Right. So let's take a look. The Gemara will clarify this. The Amar Ameimar, because the Ameimar says Hilchasa the Amar, even according to the one that says Neder Shooter at Birabin Yeshlo Hafara, that was done in public, it can still be voided. But al das Rabin Elo Hafar. Now, Hafar here probably means Hatara, because Tosfos already pointed out. First of all, that would be the standard case we're talking about, and that is the case we're talking about here. And Tosfos already pointed out that al das Rabin wouldn't work by a case of a husband being Nasir, because das doesn't really matter in that case. So we're probably here talking about Hatara. Okay, so anyway, so even if al das Rabin, if Bir Rabin doesn't work, just close off the ability of a Chacham voiding it, but al das Rabin would. Okay, now the Gemara is going to clarify in its next line some of the mechanics of al das Rabin. Wait, let me what?
Didn't we say
No, I was saying the opposite by Hafara, by the case of the husband. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. Okay, that there is, if Bir Rabin does work, it could be that it's more absolute, right? Because Bir Rabin could say once it's in public, it's a matter of public sort of record. Doesn't matter that whatever anybody is thinking. It's a matter of public record, and it's no longer a private affair. And I can't get my husband to annul it. I can't get the sage to void it. All of that is in terms of it being a sort of a personal type of an issue, as opposed to once it's become a sort of a public issue. That so if it does work, then it actually completely seals off the ability. There presumably would be no exceptions. It would prevent even my husband from annulling it, because it's not a question. It's not a question of das, right? And so that would be if it does work. But there are opinions that says that doesn't help. Just because you did it in public doesn't change the nature of the vow. So this is saying that even according to those opinions, that doing it in public doesn't change the nature of the vow, they would admit that doing it al das Rabin is relevant, because since das is always relevant to a vow, doing it al das Rabin is relevant. So the difference is if Bir Rabin works, then it's broader and more absolute than al das Rabin. But there are opinions that it doesn't work. Who cares that you said it in public? Since when does that change what the nature of the vow? Al das Rabin, that will work. Okay, but if al das Rabin works, it doesn't work in all cases. It might be that al das Rabin, Bir Rabin doesn't work at all. And Al Das Rabim does work. Okay, but nevertheless, Al Das Rabim might not work in the case of husband and wife because that their Das doesn't matter. Okay, and where it also might not work is, let's read the next case. And the Gemara says, "V'hani mili lidvar rishus." And anyway, that idea that Al Das Rabim prevents it from being annulled, that's only when it's a matter of discretion. Of a lidvar mitzvah, when the vow needs to be annulled to enable a mitzvah to be done, it's getting in the way of a mitzvah. Yesho hafara, it can be annulled. Okay, and what's an example of this? Kiahu mikri dardiki, like a case of this teacher of an elementary school teacher, a teacher of small children. The Adri Rav Acha al Das Rabin. Rav Acha made him take a vow on the das of the Rabin that he would that he could no longer teach the kids.
That if he would have teacher.
Right, we'll see.
We'll see.
All right. Okay. All right. That he could no longer teach, and if he would teach, maybe all of the fruit of the world would be usher to him or something of that nature. Or when he made him take a vow, and he made him take a vow in a way that it was al das rabim, so he could not reverse it. He couldn't go to a chacham and get it reversed. Okay. But have a pasha b'yinuki, because he was negligent with the children, and that doesn't mean that he didn't grade their papers. Presumably, it means that he hit them. Okay. All right, everybody, can we stop the comments? The hadre Ravina, and then Ravina restored him to his post. Because they couldn't find another teacher that was as good as him and as demanding of the kids as him. So obviously that's a very sad sort of statement. I mean, going back, of course, to a time in which 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, when hitting kids, was in school was a acceptable form of discipline. But it also is sad because it makes you think of contemporary cases about sexual abuse, where people will gloss over obvious signs of of abusive and sexual abuse and so on, because they say, well, he's such an effective educator and such a good teacher and so on. So anyway, but the point here is that it was understood to be that this vow is getting in the way of the mitzvah of educating the kids, and therefore he was able to be released from it. Now, what about the fact that it was al das Rabin? But the argument is, okay, but the Rabbi basically would say your personal subjective reasons that you wouldn't have taken the vow in situation A, B, and C, that's not relevant to us. We're the Rabbi. We don't have those subjective reasons. Okay, so you cannot be released from your vow on the basis of some type of tos and error, if it has to do with your subjective reality. That's the whole point of making it a communal das. But to be released from it based on an objective reality, had we known that it would have gotten in the way of a mitzvah, there's no way any of us would have wanted a vow to get in the way of a mitzvah. So therefore, that's considered a type of a tos. So again, the way Torah of a chacham works is that it identifies an error in your das. Okay, and if it's al das rabim, the subjective circumstances that you might have not intended are no longer relevant. It doesn't make it subjective. It makes it a communal das. We don't share those subjective circumstances. But if it's a type of an error, thank you so much. But if it's a type of an error that we as a community, a serious circumstance we as a community never would have acknowledged of that, there should not be a vow in those cases, then it is a basis for error, recognized error, to release it. So that's the mechanism of al das rabim. So that mechanism is not absolute to prevent releasing. It allows it in cases where the rabim would have obviously never have wanted there to be a vow, and it might not work according to Tosfos. It should have worked in the case of husband and wife, which isn't based on the wife's vow. The husband's ability to annul the wife's das has nothing to do with the wife's das. So al das rabim seems to, what the Gemara is saying is works according to everybody. Everybody agrees it's a mechanism that works, but it doesn't have absolute scope. It works only to prevent the chacham, not to prevent the husband, and even there, it doesn't work in the case of mitzvah or other types of situations. If bir rabim does work, and it's debated if bir rabim works, but if bir rabim does work, it's a different type of a mechanism. It makes it a public matter and not a private matter, and therefore takes it out of the realm of the ability to be annulled. It works whether it's for chacham, whether for a husband and wife, and would have no exceptions. Okay, so that's a very interesting difference between those two types of mechanisms.
So you're saying is there's a vision out there that would say their husband and wife, you can annul A if it was Rabbi, and B if it was al das Rabbi, both cases.
No, there's no. At least I don't know if the other Rishonim say. I know that Tosa says that a husband can never. Al das Rabbi will never stand in the way of a husband and wife.
But Rabbi would.
Yes.
Okay.
Because exactly
Because
for the
it's
reason.
also the
Al
basis.
das is not relevant for husband. No, well, according to the opinions that the rabbin works, that would solve the case of husband. That would get in the way of husband and wife.
Right, no, my question was like, can
How do
you
we
take,
pass him?
do you have like both? And there was someone saying, no matter what, I don't care about Robin, I don't care about Das Robin. Like,
Oh, there's opinion that says neither works.
yeah, so
I think Tosos raises that. I forget if there's how he concludes with that. Yes.
It's just a little confusing about Das Robin because the whole point is the husband has kind of control over, or like veto power over the das
Right.
of the wife, right?
Right.
But if it's not her das that made the vow, how does he have veto power over the das of the rabbi?
Because he doesn't. The mechanism doesn't work with. I mean, I guess you're right. If the logic of hafara is my will is stronger than your will, then when it's somebody else's will, it's not that case. But it's not an issue of will. It's an issue of it's just like I can't tolerate this vow to be in our marriage, and because so then it's like it's not about the will that was behind the vow. So that's basically the point, that the case of annulling the wife's vow is not because of her intent or her will. It's just the husband's fundamental ability to say this vow can't be sort of like it's a power issue, but not a power of will, not like a contest of wills, right? But the phenomenon of this vow I can say is not acceptable to me. Yes.
It's interesting, unless I misunderstand, the terms of the aval, he seems to be saying, you can't say al dat rabim is like stam, like as if one person can actually know what the rabbi is.
Yeah, that's a funny Rabbeinu Tam. Yeah, I mean,
right?
Yeah, that is an interesting Rabbeinu Tam. If you look in the middle of that Tosfos, he says,
Vod
Omer Rabbeinu Tam dal das, hainu keshomer al das, ploni u ploni. That al das rabim, you have to actually identify the individual. Al das rabim stam love klum.
You can't objectively know what communal desire.
Yeah, but it's a very strange Rabbeinu Tam, because the whole point of making it generic is to actually close off any avenue. There's no particular person's subjective das is relevant. It's just the community as a whole. Well, the community as a whole takes it out of any subjective circumstances. Would limit it to cases that there are objective circumstances that everybody would agree should not stand in the way of a vow.
All these categories have to do with neder, right?
Right.
So, but if they would have just kept with the shvua,
right? So let's repeat that, and then we'll go on. Which is now you could be released from a shvua if it's a future-oriented shvua in a similar way. I take a shvua that I will do X, that I won't do X. But if it's a past-oriented shvua, taking the shvua that I never took any money from the estate, right? So then that's determined, and that's not something that exists now as a thing that binds me that I can be released from. At the moment those words go out of my mouth, I'm either telling the truth or I'm lying. Right. And if I'm lying at that moment, then I made a shvuah sheker. There's nothing a chacham can do later that affects that, right? So all of these issues about 1 minute with a neder you can be released from it is only because we shifted from shvuah to neder. Absolutely. Okay, so now let's continue. So takana number 2 is, or in the Mishnah, the next thing we thought of tikkun olam, ve'edim chosmin al get mipnei tikkun olam, and the witnesses sign on a get for the sake of tikkun olam. So first of all, Tosfos has a little discussion of whether you have the v'ha'edim chosmin al get, because the Mishnah by the Almana says Hitkin Rebbe Gamliel Hazaken Shetain Dozeres Komasha Yirtzu, and then it says if it's V'ha'edim Chosmim, it sounds like that's part of Rebbe Gamliel's takana. But actually, Tosfos says it's going to be clear from what we're going to read that this idea of signing a get predated Rebbe Gamliel. Okay, so he takes out the vav. Okay, wait a minute. You only sign a get because it sort of makes for the better running of the world that she has now a signed document and doesn't have to go looking for the Adim that were actually present. The right to he, it's biblical to receive, and now it's interesting because to prove it's biblical, it's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Write in a book, in a scroll, and sign. The Amar Rabbah. So therefore, and presumably that means that anything that's to be defined as a legal document in the Torah, even if it's not even if its purpose is not to serve to proof as evidence that something took place, but as an instrument, to use it as a document of an instrument of divorce, it's only if it actually has signed witnesses in the document itself. So why is this a tikkun olam? So Amar Rabbah, let's take a look. Lo tzricha l'Rebbe Lezer. It's needed for the position of Rebbe Lezer. The Amar Edi Misira Karti, that he says that biblically speaking, that this verse is actually not required for the definition of a shtar. As another Gemara says, that's only Eitzah Tova Kamash Malan, just good advice. Okay, and so we, as Chazal, took the good advice of the verse. But the right, it's not needed. You could have something that operates as a shtar, certainly as a shtar that's what we call a shtar kinyan, a shtar that serves as an instrument to transfer a field, to marry a woman, to divorce a woman, to free a slave, when it's actually serving as an instrument, it does not need the testimony as a written into the star. Okay, it's just the good advice of that verse, and we took that good advice. Okay, but the Oraita, Edi Masira Karti, biblically speaking, the witnesses who are physically present and observe it being handed over, those are the witnesses that make it into a get. And make it into a valid document, or they're the witnesses that are necessary for the act, because it's a davar shebe'erva, a matter of personal status requires witnesses, so they might be required for just a transaction. And it might also be considered that those physical witnesses who are present is considered that their viewing of the giving over the get somehow becomes part of, validates the star itself. It's seen as part of the star, but they don't have to write their names in it. They just have to be physically present. That's all you need. Okay, but not all. That's what you need according to the Torah. So therefore, that's biblically speaking. But the Kinu Rabbanan Edi Chasima, but the rabbis established that they should actually sign their names for the sake of the of the improvement of the world. Why? The Zimni Demaisi Sadi, sometime the witnesses will die. Inami or Zimni the Azilim Medina Sayam, they'll go far away, and there's our Medina Sayam again. And then this woman won't be able to prove that she's divorced. So she might, it serves as an instrument. But you know what it doesn't serve us? It doesn't serve as evidence. So if the woman is going to want a document that's going to be evidence of her divorce, they have them go ahead and write their names in. Now, of course, it's interesting because there could be alternatives. There could be, besides that, that's always true. But it could be that we would say that the document itself wouldn't have the witnesses, but then after she was divorced, the Beis Din would write up a document that that would testify to the fact that it happened. But that just requires yet another document to be written, and this way the same document the woman gets that divorces her, that necessarily she has to receive, will be the document that serves as something she puts in the safety deposit box and will serve as her evidence. Just to remind you, there is a whole debate in the Rishonim about what happens if once they did sign the document, the Eidim, once the document is signed, to what degree do they really become Doraita part of the star? And the most obvious nafkamina of that is, let's say there were not Eidei Mesira present. Let's say, according to Rabbi Linzer, it was given only with the signed signatures and with no Eidei Mesira. So according to a number of Rishonim, that actually could work as well. That Rabbi Linzer admits that this is that this actually, if they sign, then even though it's not required Deoraita, it does Deoraita become part of the star, and then it becomes as if the signed signatures, when handed over, become like the physical witnesses that are present to testify and to be there to observe the giving over of the star. So according to somebody showing him, this works so much not only as evidence, but it works again, not that the rabbis created this. Rabbis required that it be signed, but the argument would be that according to Rabbi Linzer, once signed, that becomes a Torah recognized valid testimony that exists within the document. Not just to prove that she's divorced, but actually to serve as a substitute for the need for the physical witnesses to be present. So there's an interesting whole debate of Rishonim about how that functions. Another nafkamina would be, as we saw way at the beginning of the Masechet, what if, according to Rabbi Linzer, the witnesses signed it Shalom Lishma, right? So once you're saying that the signing gets incorporated into the nature and identity of the star, it wasn't necessary. But if you did it, it became part of the star, then how much does all the requirements of the star apply to the signing of the witnesses as well? Yes.
So I wanted to understand. So the Baal is going to narrow and says, no, this is all like Mitzvah, whatever. And the enemy would say, no, I was there.
Right.
Because 1 against 2. So once, according to Rabbi Linzer, the Eidim signed, then if he's Ma'ar, he's not believed because it's also been 1 against 2?
Well, no, it's the same halacha as as Rabbi Meir. Once the signatures are validated,
before they're validated. So
then once validated, we're going to Rabbi Meir. It's you have to get them validated, unless it was from Chutzart and you said B'fanei Nechta. And if it's all the same mechanism.
And once it was validated, wouldn't believe.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
So Rabbi Eliezer is saying it's really if the witnesses. The signing witnesses are not really necessary, but once they're there, they can replace the witnesses who saw the actual.
That is according to some Rishonim. They say that, right? That's debated.
And how does this relate to a ketubah, or does it relate? In other words, in terms of that you need signature.
No, so ksuva is a document that is not an instrument. It's a document that only testifies to the assumption of debt, of responsibility.
So you only need signing witness.
Exactly. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay. Rav Yosef Amar, Rabbi Meir. Even in Rabbi Meir, yes, it's true that you needed witnesses, but when it says that they sign, but what it says that they waited tikkun olam was how they would sign. Okay, they would spell out their names. They would write a fully identifying signature. We made tikkun olam because we done a brayso. Here, and originally you would not write your name. You would just write I. I saw. Well, it does say Ploni. It does say Ploni. Yeah, I think Rashi's girsa was. Wait, hold on. Where's Rashi? What? 1 minute. I'm sorry. You're right. No, you're right. I missed. Whatever. Fine. Okay, right. So originally you would just write your first name. I Reuven have signed as a witness. Okay. Now, if your handwriting we knew from another place, then it would be kosher. That would be fine. We would know, look, there's somebody, we know this is Reuven Schwartz's handwriting, and here it's come from another place, and we know that it's a legitimate signature. But if not pasul, and the problem would be if you said, wait, we don't recognize this signature, and we don't know who this guy is. It's Reuven. There are a million Reuvens. How are we going to find out if this is the legitimate signature of this person if we don't know who the person is, right? So we would be totally stuck. So remember Gamliel, Takana Gadol Hitkinu. They made a big takana. So notice here the use of the word takana in this bright indicates that this might have been the takana we were talking about. Okay, Sheyum Mefarshim Shmotehem Begittin. They would say it out explicitly. They would Reuven ben Yaakov, right? So so they would be much more specific, and then they would be able to find, does anybody know a Reuven ben Yaakov? And they'd be able to find the guy. Does anybody have any signatures from a Reuven ben Yaakov? And if they know whose signature we're talking about, we would be able to establish.
You narrowed it down to 1,000 guys.
Wow. Okay. Exactly.
You don't say me ear so and so.
Okay. No, not a signature. Now, if there's two, the Gemara says if there's two people in the same town that have the same name and the same father's name, then you would make it 3 generations. Okay, so when there are people with duplicate signatures, you would want. Okay, so now the Gemara, actually, that's more about the that's more about the person about the name in the get, about the husband and the wife. I'm sorry, not about the witnesses. Okay. Ubisimano, because it's a patriarchy. Ubisimano lo. Now, would it not be suffice to do it with that's what a patriarchy means, a base of kari mishpacha. Okay. Ubisimano lo. Now, are we saying that you have to actually, the only way to do it is by using your name and your father's name and so on, and not by doing some type of a symbol? So, Rav tzir kura, but Rav drew a little fish. Reb Chanina tzir, apparently instead of his signature, he drew a picture of a fish. Rabbi Chanina tzir charusa, and Rabbi Chanina drew a palm tree. Rav Chizda, that's right. Rav Chizda samech. Rav Chizda just drew a letter samech for Chizda. Rav Hoshaya ayin, I guess Hoshaya. Okay. Rabbi Baravuna tzir makosa, and he drew a what's this makosa? Oh, a sail of a ship. Okay, so anyway, so you see, you can just draw little symbols, and that counts. So, which is so funny also because there's 2 questions. Number 1 is how do we know who signed it to be Makayim it, and number 2 is that we could think that it would be the drawing would be distinctive enough as handwriting is in a signature that you could actually be Makayim it. Okay, but the Gemara says, but that doesn't bother the Gemara. It presumes that, but then it gets back to the problem of how is this better than than first names. How do you know, hey, did anybody know anybody who has a fish, right? How do you go ahead and find out if you don't know who signed it, right? How are you Mekayim it? So the Gemara says, Shani Rabbanan to Bikini Simanayu. No. The rabbis, apparently this was a thing among the rabbinic class, that they would have these little pictures, they would have these little symbols, and people knew them by their symbols. Oh, that's a Rav Chizda symbol, So therefore, it wasn't a problem to be Mekayim it because they were known by their symbols. So the Gemara says, and again, presumably it would be distinctive enough that you couldn't forge it. So the Gemara says, Meikara b'mai afki'inu. That's all very nice once they get to be known by their symbols, but it's a little circular. How did they start using their symbols, right? If you're not allowed to use something that you can't be identified by, how did you use your symbols, signing a star, if at the beginning when you weren't yet identified by it? Right? So the Gemara says, no, bediski, in like personal correspondence. So if you start having a lot of personal correspondence and you sign your name with a symbol and everybody starts to know it, then you can start using that symbol on your star. Okay, again, assuming that it's distinctive enough and that it can, so it can't be forged.
So, Rabbi, I got to make a public declaration that since the learning here is so sharp,
yes,
that hatchet on the board should be your simile.
I don't know about that. Okay, anyway, yeah. Yes. All right, now let's take a look. Now we move on to Prusbal. Okay. Okay, so Hill Hitkin Prusbal. Hill established Prusbal. Now we'll discuss in a minute what the etymology of that word might mean. Anyway, it's not hustle. Exactly. It's not hustle. We taught over there in Shviz. Okay. Prusbal ain't a mishamet. If something is written through a prusbal, it does not get annulled on Shemitah. You do not get released from the debt on Shemitah. This is all from the Mishnah over there in Shviz. This is one of the things the Hil Zaken established. He saw that people were no longer lending money to one another when the Shemitah year was coming near. Okay, they transgressed what's written in the Torah. Watch yourself, guard yourself, lest you have this, thought, this treacherous thought that's saying that the Shemitah is coming and you won't lend to the poor person. Amad Vitkin Prusbal. So he created this Prusbal to allow people to that they would lend to the poor and that Shemitah would no longer annul the debts. Now I need to say something very important here about how this is framed. Because for a lot of people, it's like, oh yes, look at that. The rabbi's getting around what the Torah is trying to do. The Torah wants to annul it. The rabbis don't like it, so they find this workaround. So the interesting thing is that the way it is framed is not that way. The way it is framed is not. This halacha of Shemitah is creating too much of a burden on the on the creditors, and we can't survive with it in our economy. It wasn't explained that way. It was explained in the terms of mitzvos, that the current situation is causing the transgression of biblical mitzvot. People are transgressing, not lending to the poor. So the best way to satisfy the Torah is not just our economic societal needs, right? But the best way to satisfy the Torah's concern that these mitzvahs are observed is by creating this reality of a prusbal. So now that's not to say that there aren't times when sometimes the human needs has to lead to certain types of takanot and certain types of workaround. Okay, but it's always better if it can be framed in terms of that this is actually compromising a mitzvah of the Torah itself, the current situation. So if we prevent the debts from being annulled, now even in that case, you have to choose which of the mitzvah is going to trump. Is it better to people to transgress not lending, but at least we're fulfilling the mitzvah of annulling the debts? Or is it better to have the people not transgress the mitzvah of not lending, have them lend, but we won't be fulfilling annulling the debts, right? It's still a trade-off, even in terms of the math of the biblical math, right? The mitzvah equation. So there's no question that Israel would rather, from a social perspective, and the well-being of the poor, of those two, rather that people lend money and the debts don't get annulled, and people don't lend money and whatever debts do exist do get annulled, right? You understand that there's still going to be a choice, but it starts by framing it as a competition of two Torah mandates that are not, the Torah recognizes the challenge. The Torah says, lend money, but the debts will be annulled, but don't let that stop you from lending money. So the Torah recognizes that people are going to be tempted not to lend money, and that's going to be a challenge. So if one of those has to give, which one is going to have to give? Now, it's quite likely that somebody with less of a vision than Hillel would say, look, we have a whole biblical institution of annulling debts. It's part of the Shemitah year. Just because individuals are transgressing, we can't undermine this whole major part of what the Shemitah year is about, right? So fine, individuals will transgress. And I'm going to say that the basic point of departure is that the debts have to be annulled, right? So Shmuel, and that's what you're going to find. Shmuel says, Hillel says no. The more important thing even for the poor, it's not more important for that, for the poor's own well-being. it's more important that they get the money and have to pay it back than that the debts be annulled and they don't get the money to begin with. Okay. So again, so the point here is that Hillel did not start by saying, "Oh, this mitzvah won't work nowadays. We have to find a workaround."
But
He said, "Oh, this people are transgressing, and biblical violations are being done, and therefore we can either allow that situation to continue, or we can change the annulling of the debt so that these violations won't be done." So he makes it a trade-off between two mitzvot, as it were. And he obviously sides in favor of the choice that is what he feels is going to be in the best interest, of the poor. Yes.
does anybody discuss it in the context of this is a reduction of our faith in Hashem? The whole idea of
Right.
that Hashem will take care if you fulfill the mitzvot.
I mean, I don't know if it's framed that way, but that's presumably correct. Yeah. I mean, now, by the way, the Torah doesn't say that about annulling the debts. The Torah says that about not working the field, that God will ensure that there will be whatever, but it does not say that, but it doesn't say that, if you annul the debts, God will pay you back for the money you lent. But we're told that by Shabbos, if you spend money on Erev Shabbos, God will pay you back. But anyway, but it's not framed that way. Now, I do want to say, of course, that the exact same issue came up in the Shemitah observance, not the annulling of debt, but Shemitah observance in Eretz Yisrael. So you look around and say that, and it just got renewed because, of course, the recent Rabbanut is so firm that they can't rely on Rav Kook's Heter Mechira, and how do you look at the situation? Do you say that, people, thousands of people, millions of people are going to violate, and therefore we have to find a technical workaround and tell all of Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew, which that really seems like much more of a fiction than Hillel's principle, okay, or do you say, no, since when do we compromise on the fact that people aren't observing the mitzvot? We're just going to keep everything natural the way it is, and that people that violate and let them violate, right? So it's the same type of a trade-off, okay? But it's not that Rav Kook just starts by saying maybe he did say at some level, he also did say that economically in Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, whatever, this isn't viable. But in addition, it could also be phrased as an issue not just about whether it's economically viable, but whether it is, it's a competition of two mitzvot, as it were. Not just sort of the human dimension, which is an important dimension in Psak, but people don't always give it the necessary weight. So it could be framed just as a mitzvah dimension. Is it more important the whole country keep the mitzvah of Shemitah and half of the country violate it? Or is it more important that we find a workaround for the mitzvah of Shemitah, right? A very similar type of a question. Okay, so anyway, let's take a look back at the Gemara. Zeu gufo shel pruzbal. This is the essence, the actual script, a text of the pruzbal. Mosrani lachem ploni uploni dayanim shemakom ploni. I am handing over to you, Reuven and Shimon, the judges in such and such a place. So you identify the beis din. Shekol chov sheyesh li ploni. That any debt that I have by a certain person, any money that this person owes me, shekvenus kozman she'erta, that I am retaining the right to collect it whenever I want. And the judges sign below, ha'edim, or the witnesses. So that doesn't really explain the mechanism. This just says, I'm making a declaration that I'm going to plan to collect it regardless. Okay, it's very nice. You're going to plan to collect it regardless. Okay, what's the mechanism by which that works? So in the mission over there, and elsewhere, the Gemara identifies this with the principle of we called Moser Shtarosav Lebeis Din, that even though you say, I plan on collecting it, since you are informing the beis din, it's sort of like you give the authority to collect the debt over to the beis din. And therefore, it's not, the Torah says, when the Shemitah comes, you shall not exact it from your neighbor. Okay, but it's no longer me who's in a position of power vis-a-vis my neighbor to be demanding and exacting the debt. I've handed that responsibility over to the beis din. So since there's no particular individual, right, it's sort of the communal beis din that has the right to collect the debt now, then the debt doesn't get annulled. Okay, that's the mechanism. For example, so if you look at Rashi, he says, Mosrani lechem. So Rashi says about, 20 lines from the bottom, 25 lines. Et tarosai, attempt you nogsim, you will be the ones to demand it and exact it. Vani loegos, I will not. So it's funny, the language is I'll collect it whenever I want, but basically the logic is maybe I'll collect it from you guys. Anyway, but you're the ones now who have the responsibility for it. Okay, so Rashi doesn't here spell that out. But the idea is about Moshe Shtos of Lebeis Din, it's no longer my personal debt, or owed to me. It's you're taking it over, so it's somehow out of that category. Okay, But that doesn't really work on a door. If that worked on a doraita level, you wouldn't need pillows takana. It is a little questionable because if some say, well, one minute, if that is a way of getting around it, what was pillows takana? And someone say, well, but it's generally understood to be that it's sort of like that's the doraita. That's the sort of claim of how it doesn't look like a direct violation of the Torah because it's framed as it's no longer your debt, it's the basin's debt. But that's still a fiction. Okay, it's not really the basin's debt. It really is your debt. So really, you did need Hillel's takana to come along and make this work. But then the question becomes, well, how did his takana make it work? If it is a fiction and the Torah says the debt should be annulled, how does this work? So that's the Gemara's question. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says, Umika midi. I'm sorry, so it's much that. Okay, so the Gemara says, Umika midi, is there anything to midoraisa mishamta shvius that Shemitah should annul at a doraita level? V'yitkin Hillel do lo mishamta, and Hillel establishes that it should not be mishamit? How could such a thing happen? How could he go ahead and undermine a doraita if there's no if the Torah really doesn't know the debt? So Amar Abaye, b'shvius bizman hazeh v'Rebbe, it's talking about Shemitah nowadays. And Shemitah nowadays, the annulling of debts is only rabbinic. And since it's only rabbinic, the rabbis can't call an end to the annulling of debts because the whole debts are anyway nowadays only annulled rabbinically.
Isn't that circular?
Well, they first made a takana to continue the practices of Shemitah, including the annulling of debts. Okay, and then they found a way to get a workaround around the. So why did they do it from the outset?
No, what I mean is when he says that it's only rabbinic in nowadays.
Yeah.
Isn't that a circular? The question was,
well, how can the
rabbis negate?
Well, no, so that's what I have to say. How do we know what makes Shemitah rabbinic nowadays? So that's going to be the next line. So let's take a look. The Tanya, we turn to Brisa. Rabbi Omer, Zedvar Shemitah Shemot. This is the matter of the Shemitah you should release. Okay, all your debts. It's talking about two Shemitahs. Achos Shemitahs karka, achos Shemitahs ksafim. The Shemitah of land and the Shemitah of monies. When you release the land, when you don't work the lands, there's Shemitah of the lands, there's Shemitah of the money. When there's not Shemitah of the lands, there's not Shemitah of the money. And the implication being nowadays there's not Shemitah of the lands, so therefore there's no Shemitah of the money. Now, why is there not Shemitah of the lands nowadays? So you could say, well, after Chorban Abayis, the land doesn't have, let's say, the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael for laws that are agricultural mitzvot, and therefore there's no longer a biblical Shemitah. So there's also no longer a biblical releasing of debts. But we rabbinically didn't want Shemitah to end, so we would have said that rabbinically, as we do say, Shemitah still applies nowadays, okay? And then even though Shemitah still applies nowadays, and that would be whether the land and whether the money, Hillel came and said, you know what, for the money thing, we're not going to say it doesn't work at all, but we're going to allow for a workaround. If you didn't do a prusbol, it will still annul the money. We're not, okay, but we're going to allow for a workaround. So that's basically the Gemara's answer. That's all rabbinic, and therefore that allowed that allowed Hillel to make a workaround. Now, the problem with this answer, as Rashi points out, is that why is Shemitah not noheg nowadays, doraita? Presumably, like I said, because it's post-Korban. There's only a bit of a problem, which is the dating. Because Hillel lived pre-Korban. So we're back to the question of how did Hillel get around it? Because in Hillel's day, it was still biblical. So Rashi quotes another Gemara, Yerushalmi, whatever, that says, no, there's a different reason why was not biblical even in the time Shemitah was not biblical even in the time of Bayit Sheni. What's the reason? Rashi says that this would be because Shemitah would, the same way the Shemitah of money is dependent on the Shemitah of land, the Shemitah of land is dependent on the practice of Yovel. And Yovel do not apply during Bayit Sheni because Yovel requires Kol Yoshvei Aleha. All of the inhabitants of the land, all the 12 tribes on the land. And therefore, even during Bayit Sheni, there was no Yovel. There was a rabbinic Yovel, but not a Doraita Yovel. And there was no Doraita Shemitah. There was no Shemitah Ksafim. So it was all rabbinic. So Hillel made his takana. Okay, so that's what Rashi says. Rabbeinu Tam actually disagrees with that and has different read of the Gemara, but I'm not going to worry about that. Okay, that's the basic argument. It was all rabbinic. Nowadays it's rabbinic because of after the Korban, and it was even rabbinic in the time of Hillel because there was no Yovel, at least Doraita. So therefore, that allowed Hillel to make his takana because the whole thing was rabbinic to begin with. So the Gemara is still not happy. The Gemara says, "The takina rabbana d'tashami teichel shviyas," and the rabbi started. I'm sorry, I didn't get to the question. The rabbi started with a takana that we're going to continue Shemitah even nowadays, and even with no Yovel, and even after the Korban, we're going to continue Shemitah to remember Shemitah. But that worked fine by the karka. Even by the karka, it didn't work fine, but okay. But it actually created problems also with the debts. You saw that people stopped lending. He established the pruzbal. So it works because the whole annulling of debts in his time and nowadays was Durabana. Tosfos basically says, no. In the time of Hillel, it was Doraita. And when Hillel established the pruzbal, it was because he was looking into the future, anticipating that there would be a Churban Abayis and it would be Durabanan, and he made us the kind of future time. Very hard to believe that was the case. Okay, for whatever reason, it was rabbinic in Hillel's time. We'll say because there was no Yovel. Certainly, it's rabbinic nowadays, and that's why the pruzbal works. So the Gemara is still not happy because how did you make the original takana to say that there would be a rabbinic annulling of debts? That also is a question. I don't get it. So let's go back to the idea that you said that we rabbinically instituted Shemitah, right? Before Hillel's pruzbal. Well, how could there be a case that before the rabbis came along, there was no Shemitah and the debts were not annulled? And now the rabbis are telling me that debts have to be annulled. You get it? It's not questioning Hillel's pruzbal. It's questioning the establishment of Shemitah, of a rabbinic Shemitah prior to Hillel that annulled the debts. How did the rabbis establish a Shemitah to annul debts once it biblically was no longer applicable? How are they getting you out of the money that you owe me, right? You understand the question? Yes? David, you give me a look. No?
No.
What?
I'll follow.
No. Listen, it's very straightforward. Okay, I think it is straightforward. Here you have, okay? Here you have Bayit Rishon, okay? Where you have Yovel, Shemitah's Karka, and Shemitah's Ksafim. Okay? Ksafim. Okay? Then you come to Bayit Sheni, and there's no Yovel. Okay? There's no biblical Yovel. There's only Durabanan, a Yovel. Okay? There'll be a Durabanan Yovel, rabbinic Yovel. Okay? Because there's no Yovel, there's no Shemitah's Karka. Okay? There's no biblical Shemitah's Karka. Because there's no biblical Shemitah's Karka, there's no biblical Shemitah's Ksafim. This is all during Bayit Sheni, right? Okay, but the rabbis are going to reinstitute all of these things during Bayit Sheni. Okay, and because it's all rabbinic, the Shemitah's Ksafim, Hillel can come and say a Durabanan of pruzbal. Okay, pruzbal now will address the Durabanan of Shemitah's Ksafim. Okay, that's what Hillel's doing. Yes. So what the Gemara says is, okay, we got now how Hillel could make his pruzbal because it's only attacking the Durabanan, compromising the Durabanan of Shemitah's Ksafim. But how did they make this Durabanan of Shemitah's Ksafim? Before they made their Durabanan, money that was owed had to be paid. Right? The biblical annulling stopped. People had to pay their debts. So how did the rabbis come and say, oh, now we're going to rabbinically say you don't have to pay your debts on Shemitah because we're going to continue this idea of Shemitah rabbinically? What allowed them rabbinically to create a Shemitah and to get people out of their debts? You still have this blank look on your face.
How does it? That's what Hillel did, right?
Hillel stopped the rabbinic annulling of debts. But how did the rabbis annul the debts to begin with? The Torah's Shemitah stopped, okay, in Bayit Sheni time. So before the rabbis did anything, people had to pay their debts during the Shemitah year. Right? You get it? Before the rabbis did anything. During Bayit Sheni, if you owed me money, what happened in the Shemitah year? What happened in the Shemitah if you owed me money? In the Bayit Sheni time, before the rabbis did anything.
Nothing.
No, you paid. There was no Shemitah, you had to pay me.
Okay, right.
There was even on Shemitah, you paid me, right? Because there was no biblical Shemitah and there was no rabbinic Shemitah. So the rabbis came and said, no, you don't have to pay anymore. We're instituting a rabbinic Shemitah. What allowed the rabbis to institute a rabbinic Shemitah
over the biblical obligation you have to pay
your debt? Okay.
You can't go to Starbucks.
So the Gemara says, okay, umika midi, is there anything to be deraisa lo mishamta shvius that biblically Shemitah would not annul the debt? But kinu rabbanan just shamit. Amar bayi shevel tasel. Yeah, it's just like we're not actively telling you to violate a deraisa. We're just passively saying, don't pay your debt, don't collect your debt. Well, don't pay. So that yes, we were able to say that an institute of rabbinic Shemitah.
Well, I don't get that answer. What does that mean? In other words, like we
tell you not to take the lulav when first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. So we'll tell you not to pay your debts. Okay, Rav Amar, Rava's answer is a better one. Rava says, Hefker based in how you hefker. No, rabbis can change. When it comes to money, the rabbis can manipulate things. Okay, and the rabbis can release people of their debts. What the Basin says is hefker, is onerous as hefker. So therefore, they were able to institute a rabbinic Shemitah and release people of their debts because they have control over money. For the rabbis have that power. How do you know that? The Amar of Yitzchak Minayin Shefker Beis Din Hayefker. How do you know that things that the Beis Din will null become a null? Shne'emar, or not a null, make ownerless when they sort of make the change ownership of property. The Kol Asher Lo Yavo L'Shlosh Yamim. Look, it's even from a Bayit Sheni a pasuk. Anybody that does not show up in 3 days, katzatz hasarim bazakenim, based on the sort of advice or whatever the command, the edict of the officers and the elders, yecharam kol b'chusho, all of his property will be banned. He'll be separated out from the community. So you see that they have the ability to control ownership of property. Rabbi Linzer has a different verse. Rabbi Linzer. These are the what's the word?
The lots.
The lots, yeah. But anyway, the portions or whatever, right?
They say inheritance.
Yeah, I know, but it's anyway.
Portion.
Anyway, these are the portions that were bequeathed by Elazar the Kohen and Yoshua bin Nun and the heads of the tribes, etc. When they were dividing up the land of Israel. So why does it say Rashi Avot, the heads of the fathers? Or it should say the heads of the tribes. What do you mean heads of the fathers? To tell you, the same way fathers can bequeath to their children whatever they want, the heads can bequeath to the people what they want. Now there's a difference between these two drashot, because the first drasha, it's only used in the punitive sense. If you don't show up, your property is banned, it's put on the ban. Is banned, right? And we're going to take your property away from you. That's the power of like a court to levy fines or to to seize your property. Okay, but that's punitive, right? That's the first drasha. The second drasha, when the same way the heads of the nation divvied up the land of Israel, that's not punitive. That's saying fundamentally they have the right, the same way a father bequeaths to his children, they represent the people, and they have a right to redistribute, the wealth of the nation. Okay, and that's the different drasha of Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Now, Rashi raises an important point. So now what we've said is Shemitah was rabbinic, and Hillel's takana, and the reason we made a rabbinic shmita was because we can control ownership, and therefore we can money, and therefore we can void debts. And then Shmuel was able to make his rabbinic institution, which was to what do you call it? Which was to get around that rabbinic law. But Rashi raises a question. Once we've introduced the idea of Hefker Beis Din Hefker, that Beis Din can control money, we have an answer to our question of how Hillel could get around the biblical law of Shemitah. The law of Shemitah could be biblical. It could be the right of the debts are voided, and nevertheless, Hillel will allow you to collect your debt after Shemitah. How could he do that? Because Hefker Beis Din Hefker, the person just reinstitutes to that. The Torah came along and voided it. Fine, the Torah avoided your debt, and now we won't only collect, let's say during Shemitah or something, but after Shemitah, we will reinstitute your debt. Okay, so Rashi says, once the Gemara introduces Hefker Beis Din Hefker, we can understand how what Hillel does works even against the Torah's, what do you call it? The Torah's Shemitah. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says, if you look at Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, Mika Midi, the Midoraisa Meshami Shvius, Tosa said, Tosa says, Hashtalo by Rava Lishnu Yehach Kusha Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Why didn't Rava give the answer? Here's how Hillel could go against the Torah's Shemitah because of Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Why didn't they give that answer? Jishani Basyachi, Mishum Dekashale, Lo Aya Lo Hillel Akor Shvius Shehidoraisa. Meaning, what Tosa is saying is, the problem wasn't what mechanism is available to Hillel. Hillel maybe has a mechanism to do pruzbo to get around the Torah's law of Shemitah. The question is, how could you do such a thing? How could you blatantly go against and undermine a Torah institution? Sure, you have the mechanism, but why are you? What would let you use that mechanism, right? In such a blatant way now? Because I'm trying to ultimately preserve the Torah because I'm trying to get people to lend money and not violate. That all might be very nice, but you can't do it in such a blatant way, or you can't do it in a way that really challenges in that profound way a biblical institution. So I want to say that there's an interesting parallel to what we said before about Hafkas Kiddushin. When we learned Hafkas Kiddushin, I mentioned to you the position of the Rashba that says, yes, the rabbis do have the power to retroactively annul a marriage. But they will never do it retroactively because, that's such a blatant, show of power that we, the rabbis, are going to go ahead and something that for the last 20 years they've been happily married and it's been recognized as a biblical marriage, and we're going to say it never existed. That is a blatant show of rabbinic power against a biblical institution. So we need to, what I call this the fig leaf approach, we need to hide behind something that it doesn't look that's not an obvious challenge to the biblical institution of marriage. So we're only going to say Hafkas Kiddushin when there's a get. The get might be puzzle, okay, but if there is a get, even if it's a puzzle one, it doesn't look like we are voiding the Kiddushin. It looks like she's divorced by the get. So the same thing you could say is true here. Remember, I said to you that the logic of Prisbol was that it was giving over the debts to Beis Din, okay? But if that's true, why do you need that logic at all? And the point is, or if that logic works, why did you need Hillel's Takana? And the answer could be that maybe that doesn't really work. It really doesn't work to give over your debts to Beis Din. You're not really giving them over to Beis Din, but it serves as the fig leaf. Because we can't go ahead and just blatantly say, oh, so the Torah's law, the Torah's thing doesn't apply because we did something Hillel asked us to do, right? There has to be a logic in which it's not coming across as a straight override of the Torah institution. So there's 2 points. Number one is Tosfos saying why would we ever, how could we have the chutzpah to go ahead and to undermine a Torah institution? And the answer might be, okay, by Hillel's day, it was only rabbinic. It wasn't really a Torah one. Now, how do we have the mechanism? How do we have the authority, or would we do something so blatant? You might have the mechanism to do it, but how could you do it? And the answer was it was only rabbinic, okay? But Rashi says it could even be biblical. But the other question that I'm pointing out is, how would we couldn't sort of, do it in a way that was blatant, even when we were doing it. And therefore, it was important to use this the mechanism that even if it didn't really work, looked like it worked, and that was the mechanism of giving the debt over to the Beis Din. And that's the end of this Tosfos. So just read the next line of Tosfos. He says, the Avagav did Rashina b'Sifrei v'asher yilach etzachicha tashmeit yadecha v'lo shalachicha biyadcha mikan amru hamav v'chaveira al mashkon u'moseh shosef the Beis Din ein meshamtin. There's only when the debt is to you, but if you hand it over to Beis Din, it's not annulled. Tosfos says, "Mikomakam lo yalo laso takana l'lamed lasos kashi batel." It's midas ksafim, and then he said, and anyway, whatever. So those are the second answer. I shouldn't write it. The next answer is getting a little confused, but the next answer Tosfos says is first is that that's really just an asmachta. That really it doesn't work to hand. He has 2 answers, but the second answer is it doesn't work to hand it over to Beis Din, but we need it to look like it worked. Okay, so again, in this context of the idea of tikkun olam, the upshot is, because this is often lost on people that see this principle as this whole big model of rabbinic, where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way, which it might be, but it's important to understand some of the qualities of it, because about how we frame the issues. We don't frame it like, oh, this Torah law doesn't work. It's too heavy on the people. Let's find a workaround. It was framed as this Torah law is coming at the cost of another of Torah mitzvah. It's one mitzvah against another mitzvah. Because of Shemitah, people are transgressing. So we have to find a way to solve that balance. It's not framed in terms of the cost to the people, although that might be what motivates you, which side of the scale you tip the balance. The other issue is that we're not just going to go ahead and blatantly override a Torah law. According to Tosfos, the question in the Gemara is, we know you have the mechanism, but that doesn't mean that you should have the will or the ability or the propriety of doing such a thing. It might only be a rabbinic law. Okay, and the other thing is, even when we are overriding it, or if we are, we're going to not, again, do it blatantly, but we're going to do it through a mechanism of handing it over to Beis Din, which may or may not work, but at least it looks like it works. And that's also part of this whole process.
Is the kind of legal authority, rabbinic legal authority to, so to speak, override a